Hello everyone, it's Karen at the Cool Tools Studio. Today's video is a little bit of a follow-up on the initial video that I did where I introduced Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay. Since Phoenix has been out on the market, we've received some feedback on what people like and what people are struggling with. It seems like the biggest difference between the way that Phoenix performs and other clays that have exited the market or people are used to working with performed is the way that it makes connections. I'm talking about layering, adding accents, putting on bales, and today's video is just going to cover the different ways that you can make sure your connections are secure. Following the release of the lump clay of Phoenix, Cool Tools has also released syringe and paste versions of this clay. And I'm going to show you how those can be used or how you can create your own homemade paste or just use lump clay to make connections with Phoenix. And when water can be used or when you should use something more substantial like the syringe or the paste or even clay to be making your connections. What you use to make your connections is going to depend upon the state that your clay is in. So for example, are you joining wet to dry, or dry to dry? So let's start off by talking about wet to wet connections. So Phoenix clay, when it's wet, or like when you've just freshly rolled it, it has pretty good kind of surface melting qualities where it pretty readily makes a slip on the surface itself. So for wet to wet, especially if there's a lot of surface connection or surface contact, you can use just water. But what I'm doing here is I'm dampening both surfaces to be connected until I see it kind of forming that slip. And then I'm going to be joining them. And again, I feel comfortable doing this because the surface contact here is basically the whole piece. It's not like it's just joining one little spot. There's plenty of surface area here to make a really strong connection with just this water. And this is a really nice way to work with Phoenix as well because it is so strong. Like I'm kind of putting pressure on this texture here and I'm not distorting it. And I'm not worried about boogering up edges or anything. So I'm just kind of rotating it a little bit to kind of mix and blend those two slips and adding a little bit of downward pressure. And then I'm going to go along the edge and add a little bit more water just to kind of close up that seam and really solidify that connection. So earlier I was saying I feel really comfortable doing this just with water because there's a lot of surface contact. Let's say I've got this piece here and it's freshly rolled and it's considered wet and I want to add a bale. There's not going to be the same amount of surface contact, so for something like that I would want to come in and add a little bit of syringe to reinforce that connection. I'm going to start off just how I did by adding some water, just like before, to kind of create that slip on that surface. And I do that on both surfaces to be joined. And again, this doesn't have as much surface contact, so I'm going to be adding some slip to really reinforce, or some syringe rather. And to do that, I love syringe for this. It's so convenient. You could make paste and pick it up with a clay shaper and use it to apply. But with syringe, you can just run a bead along that edge. Oop, that'll be plenty. And some here too to spread out. I'm just going to use a brush to kind of loosely distribute it. And that'll be fine. And then at this point, I'm going to position it. And if you were being really particular about this, you could take something like a sort of circular form to form over and support it as you work. But again, for a connection like this, especially since it's going to be bearing the weight of your piece, you want to make sure it's a very strong connection. And you can do so by using paste or syringe to reinforce it. So I would kind of consider this like my tack. I would allow this to completely dry, and then once it has dried, I would dampen the areas again my points of connection, and then just come back in with a little bit more syringe to kind of spread out. It's just usually a little less sloppy if you let it dry in between the initial tack and then reinforcement. It's still kind of like moving a little bit, and you can't really apply as much pressure to smooth things out as you can if it dries. But really quickly, I just wanted to show you how you can lay some more down and really blend out and reinforce those points of connection. So to kind of reiterate, for wet-to-wet connections, Phoenix works really well for kind of like layered pendants if there's a lot of surface contact. But for just, in general, any weight-bearing connection or anywhere where there isn't a lot of surface contact, you're going to want to come in and reinforce those connections with syringe or paste. So another wet-on-wet connection that you may be trying to make is kind of like a butt joint of two ends here. And for something like this, I usually come in and dampen both ends. And then to kind of get them to stick really nicely, it's just easy to put a little bit of syringe on one of the ends. And then I'm going to use that to help these ends stick together and blend it out with a dampened brush. And the stickiness of the syringe or the pre-made paste that Cool Tool sells really helps kind of connections like this where there isn't a lot of contact. Kind of gives them some extra sticking power. And then as the paste or syringe dries, because it does have a higher water content than your clay, it is going to kind of shrink. So usually with something like this, I'll do it once, blend it out, and it'll look smooth, and then as it dries, you'll kind of notice a little bit of a place where it's sunken a little bit, and then I'll go in and add more paste or more syringe and kind of overfill, and then once it dries, just sand it and clean it up. But like I said, the syringe or the paste really helps places that don't have a lot of surface contact stick. So that's how you could kind of close a jump ring or make a ring and make a kind of butt and joint connection. So now that we've covered wet to wet connections, let's talk about dry to dry. And dry to dry, at least for me, has been the biggest sort of change in the way that I've had to get used to working. My favorite clay is Easy 960, and that joins super readily dry to dry with just water for a lot of connections. On the other hand, Phoenix, it does dry to dry connections well with just water for only very small elements. And for connections like that, you need to wet both of the areas to be connected, let it soak, and then wet them again and join them. So for something like this, these little teeny tiny dots, they're small enough that I would feel okay making a wet or making a dry to dry connection with just water. But for something bigger, like a set stone or potentially these finishing touches, if you actually flip them over, the back on some of them aren't perfectly flat, so that's not going to be a lot of surface contact. So for something like that, you'd want to reinforce with slip and syringe. But for just teeny tiny dots, you can do just water, and I'm going to show you again how to do that. So say I want to put some dots at this top corner here. I'm going to wet and allow that to kind of soak. And then I'm going to put some water on my tough card, grab some tweezers, and kind of rotate my dot in that water to kind of soften that surface there to be connected. And let it sit for a bit. And then again, I'm going to come back to this area and kind of double up. Since it's softened a little bit with the water that was previously there, I'm going to add some more water. That way it accepts it. So there's my dot that's been softening and sitting there. I'm going to pick it up and move it and apply some downward pressure. So again, that area is still kind of softening. I'm gonna make a couple more dots here that I'm gonna place. Really work that water in. So for Phoenix Dry to Dry, you really need to spend some time letting the water kind of soak and working it in. Put another dot there. Maybe one more there. And then for something like this, once it's dry, I would recommend sanding it with a sanding pad over this top face, a microfine, just to kind of knock it around and make sure that they're attached. Because if they're going to stick when they're in greenware, when that fires, they're going to fuse, and that's going to be a strong connection. But if you can knock it off in greenware, it's a lot easier to fix it in greenware. And it's just a good test to make sure that that connection is going to hold up for you. So again, water to water, I would only use on really small elements, mostly because it's going to be hard to put slip or paste on that and place it without it getting really messy looking. But let's talk about putting larger pieces on dry to dry. So for something like this set stone, I'm going to flip it over, and just like I have been for all these other connections, start off with some water to soften and soak on those surfaces. So then you can do this with either syringe or a paste, but with Phoenix, just generally, I don't really recommend a slip, like a really thin slip is not going to reinforce or add structure to the connections like you need it to. So again, you can kind of see here how that water already soaked in. So I'm going to add some more. And then at this point, I'm going to quickly show you how I go about making my own paste for connections like this, if you don't want to buy a container of it. Container's super convenient, but sometimes it's nice to just make as you go. I just picked up some water on a clay shaper here, and I'm pressing down to kind of incorporate it. And kind of fold it in. And I make a really thick paste for making connections with Phoenix. It's nice and sticky. It's like when you apply pressure, it fills really well. You don't want a thin paste. So for something like this, I would scoop it up with my clay shaper and then apply it to my piece that I'm connecting. Some on that edge there. Just drop it and then position it more precisely with my tweezers. And just push down. You can see it kind of came out on my edges there. That's fine. It really easily softens up with water, kind of like it does for wet to wet connections, and blends out super readily. So then after this dries, you could take a look at it and see if there are any gaps or if you need to do another round of fill with some more paste. But usually this is plenty for making a nice strong connection for something like that. Again, for bigger finishing touches, especially because sometimes as you're making them, some parts will be higher or lower, I would actually use syringe or paste to reinforce a connection like that, just because it doesn't, Phoenix, especially if you dry it on a hot plate, it doesn't have the kind of flex that some of the other clays do, where you can kind of push it down and make it have more surface contact. So for something like that, let's say I was going to put a leaf over here. It's already kind of damp from that other connection there, but there's that high end there. So to give myself some material to kind of fill and smooth out and make this connection strong, you can either pick up some more paste, or again, syringe is just super convenient. Just plop some on there. Pretend you're gonna go over here. And then just press down. And then clean up any overfill. don't think you're ever going to be like, oh no, I added too much syringe and paste and my connection's too strong. It never hurts to reinforce connections unless it's going to get sloppy. Like I said, with these little dots, it's hard to do cleanly. But with something like this, there's plenty of space to kind of clean it up, and it can't hurt to add some extra strength to your connections. So another thing that's kind of different with Phoenix and the way that it works is I sometimes make my connections dry to dry with just straight lump clay. It makes a really strong connection, and one of the instances where I sometimes use that method is for bales. This is kind of a goofy bale for this piece, but it's just a flat piece that I have laying around. This is super simple, just sheet of clay that was wrapped around some sort of mandrel and allowed to dry. But for something like this, if you wanted to just use lump clay, it makes a really strong connection, and it's really quick and straightforward. Gonna wet both pieces. I just grab a pinch, kind of roll it into sort of a coil, and I'll press it on here. Knock off the excess. Whoops, it's running away. And then you can see it kind of already soaked in that water from before. Let's add a little more. And then I'm just going to push down and apply pressure. And again, you can kind of see how it flowed out over my edge there, but because of that nice surface melt when it's wet quality, it's really easy to clean up and smooth out that excess clay, and that's going to be a very strong connection for me. So the last type of connection that you might be making with Phoenix clay is dry to wet, and for that I'm going to demonstrate this kind of style of ring that I've really enjoyed making with Phoenix, where you start off with just either a patterned piece plopped on top of a ring band or a stone, and then you just kind of fill in and build with the lump clay. So I just demonstrated how you can use lump clay to make dry to dry connections, and we're going to be working in a similar method for dry to wet, where I'm just going to be dampening the place where I'm going to be applying the wet clay. And then you don't have to put syringe or paste in between dry clay and lump clay when you're working with Phoenix. So for something like this, I just grab my lump clay. I'm going to kind of initially sort of shape it, and then I just squish it on. And then it's kind of hard to do this because I'm kind of doing it upside down, so I'm not blocking your view with the back of this mandrel stand. But once I've kind of initially pushed it on, I would add a little bit of water and then just alternate between clay shapers and my fingers to blend out this wet to dry connection. And again, you don't have to put paste or anything like that in between when you're adding wet clay to your dry clay. Just add a little bit of water to your dry clay to kind of soften that surface so it accepts the new clay. And it's a really quick and easy way to kind of make these fun rings that just have this kind of nice transition from band to focal point. And you can kind of, at this point it'd be difficult to add more on top of that and keep shaping, because the layer below it would kind of smush and distort as you go. So for something like this, I'd kind of smooth this out and allow it to dry, and then add a little bit more to kind of continue building and shaping this project. But for dry to wet, you just dampen the dry clay and then add your lump directly on. I hope this video helps you make successful connections when building your metal clay compositions. Thanks for watching.